Declan. Maybe I can hand over to you for that segment of this webinar.
Thank you, Doc, for that. Yeah, so after such deep insights on various topics, I think it would be helpful to respond to some questions, even to gain ability. I'll push the first question to Veronica, who talked more on the invisible child, quote unquote, and this is matters intersex children, and the question is from Naum, who's based in Nairobi, and she's asking, what is the government doing to enhance intersex children education rights? And what boarding schools, for instance, are they being admitted in? Veronica?
Thank you for that question. I would want to first state that prior to COVID-19 pandemic, the Intersex Persons Implementation Coordination Committee and also the National Commission on Human Rights had already begun engagement with Ministry of Education with regard to addressing cases that were brought on board of children, to be precise, 6 children who are intersex children, and they were having difficulties transitioning from primary school to secondary school. So all 6 cases were assisted, and these children are now in the right schools or in the comfortable and secure schools. But with regard to putting in mechanism that is sustainable, the committee is working closely with the Ministry of Education and the Office of the Attorney General and other actors, including the civil society organization that works with intersex persons, to develop guidelines that will ensure and enhance inclusivity and access to education for intersex children across the country. Thank you.
Yeah, Veronica, if we can push further. Are there some, and this is a question from Jasmine in Nairobi, are there some programs in place to sensitize the public, especially teachers and caregivers? And you did give us the example of a caregiver mentality, which was wajinga, or ujinga, which indicates very, very negative view of this matter. But so to that effect, are there some programs to sensitize the general public?
Thank you for the question again. Yes, there are programs that have been developed to address and to sensitize the gap, to address the public and sensitize the entire public, not just the intersex persons community, but also the different actors, the professionals. And what we had done initially, that is from last year, December, up to February this year, the committee had already started regional engagement. These regional engagements were mapping out the different caregivers, both in schools, the different duty bearers we have, the community, by holding dialogues, regional dialogues, which were helping in terms of just first and foremost, helping the people in the different counties, that is the 12 counties that we targeted, to start the conversation about the plight of intersex persons, the challenges they face, and also I agree on how do we move at the county level. What innovations can we bring on board to increase the advocacy for the rights of intersex children? Yes, there are programs, and even as we go on, they'll be seeing a lot of webinars speaking to the public, but also we have also developed IEC materials for the public use. So beyond that, I believe even beyond COVID-19, there's a lot of interactions with the public and the different stakeholders that are already scheduled. Thank you.
Great, and maybe we can just keep it still. We're going through a global pandemic, COVID-19, and we've seen increase in gender-based violence and violence against children. For instance, have we noticed any evidence in increased violence against intersex persons?
Thank you. In terms of violence perpetuated against intersex persons, so far we have not received any gender-based related case or complaint. But what we have also done, noticing that this pandemic brought about an emergency situation and different measures were put in place that again were based on the discriminatory laws that are already in existence, we as a committee and also as a commission, we have been monitoring the different, the impact of COVID-19 to the families of intersex persons, but also monitoring the cases that are being reported. So we have been using an SMS number that is 22359, which we have really encouraged the persons, the intersex persons, the public and the stakeholders to really reach out when they have an issue. So far, we have received 36 cases from the intersex community. I would really I shock you by just indicating that the 30 out of the 36 cases you have received, 33 cases are raising concerns about the lack of survival or the lack of ways or means of fending for these intersex children and intersex families. And this is again is an impact by COVID-19, where most of the family intersex households are single-headed families, and the stigma and the mental fatigue that comes with raising a child sort of leads to the single-headed families. And also the levels of economic empowerment are really low. So the 33 cases we have received so far speak to lack of food, lack of access to those casual jobs, and also some of them have been sent out of their homes. So we are working closely with the organizations that support intersex persons to provide some of this food, to provide some of this money for rent, and also medication. But beyond that, what we have also done, focusing on the responsibility of the state, we have also activated follow-up mechanism to ensure that intersex persons are also remembered or they are acknowledged when it comes to equalization social protections initiatives, which other vulnerable children benefit from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I'd like to engage Dr. Saudamini a little bit. Dr. Saudamini took us through matters transitional justice and the importance of transitional justice. And the first question I'd like to ask you, Dr. Saudamini, is what you did indicate your extensive experience in various countries and jurisdictions as far as children and transitional justice is concerned. Amal Mohammed from Nairobi is asking, is there a best standard for successfully involving children in reconciliatory process in any of these countries? And how did they achieve this? How did this particular country achieve this?
Okay, thank you for the question. What I will say initially is that there are good practices. We can say there's a best practice because in each situation, it requires the specific context to be taken into consideration and to reflect the experiences of the children, their families, and communities. You know, I mentioned the Sierra Leone case, and I mentioned also the case in Nepal, where a truth commission was not pursued or has not been as yet, but a national dialogue was pursued. Recently in Sri Lanka, we were working with local national organizations, building capacity around specifically reconciliation in the aftermath of a conflict. And that has been also quite, I would say, successful. In each of these cases, the process continues. So it's a pursuit of reconciliation that is ongoing. Thank you.
Cool. If I could segue into another question from Iqbal in Nairobi. Do the victims demand any form of accountability based on your experience? Do they demand any form of accountability or justice for what they've suffered?
Yes, that's a huge issue. I mean, the example that comes to mind there is the case in Uganda, where there was quite a strong debate about whether the mechanisms to address accountability would be best to follow the traditional Matu Oput reconciliation process or to pursue criminal prosecution and accountability. And the victims, you know, again, there's no one answer, because there were diverse positions and opinions, but in some cases, in particular in that situation, some of the victims really were adamant about pursuing formal criminal prosecution. That isn't always the way to have impact across community and to pursue reconciliation. So that judicial and non-judicial pathways towards accountability and towards reconciliation vary. I mean, the situation also in Colombia and the children's involvement in that conflict led to also debates about that responsibility or potential accountability for one of the longest conflicts, you know, in history, and that the involvement in children in the process now, in the aftermath of that conflict, it's complex. In particular, the reparations programs have involved children. So there is a different, let's say, palette for pursuing accountability in each case. Still today, the situation that was pursued in Sierra Leone introduced quite a lot of new precedent, both in terms of the non-judicial Truth Commission accountability, as well as the criminal prosecutions that were through the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So that range of possibilities for reconciliation is specific to the context. But it's very interesting to consider education. And this was mentioned also by our other panelists, how important that is in building reconciliation over the long term, in ending, you know, and preventing non-recurrence. That's really, I would say, a very important key, you know, in how the next generation can learn from the past in order to prevent recurrence of violence. How do we do that? We have to do that again through education, both informal, community-based, but also formal education in the schools, so that we learn what and how to build a peaceful and stable society with the full engagement of the communities who have been affected, both as victims, but also as perpetrators, so that we can come together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saudamini. I'll move on to Dr. Laibuta. Dr. Laibuta took us through, you know, policy and advocacy, and he talked about every child, every right as a golden string that cuts across all these legislations. And the question I'd like to ask you, Dr. Laibuta, is from Amal Mohammed in Nairobi, who says, following the publishing of the latest report on children in the justice system in Kenya and your work in the Children Bill, what is the biggest obstacle for children in the justice system? And that's probably a Kenyan perspective and maybe some global insight, global trends as well.
Thank you, Declan. I think the biggest hindrance or stumbling block in the juvenile justice system in Kenya is lack of a well-defined regulatory or legislative framework. Indeed, even though we have had the practice of diversion practiced in our children's courts, we haven't had a set of court rules and regulations that define a step-to-step practical approach to diversion. What we've had are standard operating systems, of course, which do not carry the force of law. But for the first time now, after the enactment of the bill and the draft rules and regulations that we have in place right now, waiting enactment of the Children Bill 2020, we will have a defined legislative, both substantive and subsidiary, frameworks for child justice. There was an attempt some years back to come up with the law, with the statute law on juvenile justice, way back. I think it must have been around 2014, 2015, but it was felt that the trend in Kenya was to consolidate the law relating to children matters. That is why we had the 2001 Act earlier on, repealing, say, the Adoption Act, Guardianship of Infants Act, the Young Persons Act, and various other segregated pieces of legislation that dealt with different matters related to children. The consolidating statute law, of course, fell behind times with the promulgation of the constitution that is in force presently from the year 2010. So it became necessary to reform the law and have yet another consolidating statute, the children bill that we are dealing with right now, that is just about to be presented to Cabinet for approval, and then take on the usual legislative process of publishing public participation through the various parliamentary committees, and eventually enactment. Once that is done, then we will have also a defined regulatory and framework for rules of procedure in various courts to deal, not just with children in conflict with the law, but on all matters that affect the children, adoption, foster care, guardianship, care and protection, children institutions, and so forth. So we are just about there, but of course we've had quite a number of impediments. The sector that deals with children matters attracts a lot of interest from various state and non-state agencies. Individuals, of course, who have their funded programs that draw funds from various sources to run programs for children in care and protection and so forth. And there was the push and pull as to who should have power to do what. Of course, every player wants to have a lead in doing what has to be done. But that pulled us back for a while. But I think we've broken through that impediment to have a well-defined legislative framework.
Oh, great. Another quick one, Dr. Laibuta, from Togori Mathenge, who asks, there has been a normative lack of clarity on whether the best interest principle is applicable in criminal proceedings against children. Is this really applicable?
No, that's a misconception. In fact, if you look at the diversion procedures and also the justice system that deals with children, whether they are held in remand homes or rehabilitation schools, or children accommodated in children's institutions for whatever reason, trust me, the standard set now, if they go through Parliament with these draft pieces of legislation, we will have at every stage considering the best interest of the child. We do this because we believe that children have special needs. They need to be treated not as not as criminals when they offend. They need to be corrected. They need to be guided, and that's why we do not even talk of them as criminals. We don't talk of sentencing them. We don't talk of convicting them. But the approach always is to reform the children and guide them to grow and develop. However, what Leslee presented here is fundamental for all of us to take note of. Some of the children grow in very disadvantaging environments, and to shape them using law and programs becomes very difficult. So we know that there are those in respect of which it is too late to have corrective measures, but we nonetheless try to come up with legislation that leans towards correction, reform, rather than retribution and punishment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laibuta. I really appreciate your response. I think I'll move next to Leslee Udwin. I personally had the privilege to actually work with Leslee, and we continue working. And I'm sure Leslee will also be very happy to hear that Dr. Laibuta picked an insight from her presentation. And first question to Leslee.
All my awards. That's all I needed to hear. Dr. Laibuta, thank you. That's what matters most.
Great. Yeah. So Justice Martha Comey is asking Leslee, and the question is, how do you ensure the teaching done children in Think Equal are carried out adulthood in the midst of a strong culture that trumps the law?
I need you to repeat that because the sound was not great. How do we ensure in Think Equal?
So I'll take that again. So Justice Martha Comey, who's based in Nairobi, how do you ensure the teaching done children in Think Equal are carried out through adulthood in the midst of a strong culture that trumps the law?
Thank you. A very persuasive question. Now, how we ensure is through the simplicity of the science of brain development. There have been many, many studies. And by the way, anybody who's interested in seeing them, I will send you happily a summary which we have, which is incredibly thick. There have been many studies which show that when you teach social and emotional learning in the early years, this does form a foundation for later behaviors. And it predicts the perpetration of crimes in adulthood. So, for example, a child who has had significant and quality social emotional learning in its early years will be 86% less likely to ever come into contact with the police than a child in a control group, which is not. Academic marks themselves rise by 17%. So this should be very motivating and persuading to parents. There's evidence, there's scientific evaluations and evidence that it lasts. And it's not surprising because 95% of the human brain is fully developed by the age of 5. And these neuro pathways, which are set for pro-social or anti-social behaviors and attitudes, are set by that point, which is why I believe we are actually certifiably insane to try and spend our energies undoing that set pattern rather than creating it right in the first place. And another aspect, I think, implied at least by your question, is what happens to those children who we teach these wonderful pro-social, caring, compassionate, empathetic ways in their classroom communities, and they go home and they are immersed in or witness to or victims of the kind of human rights abuses that take place in homes by these adults who have not had the privilege or care shown to them for them to have learned how to value themselves and other human beings. Well, what happens is that the children go in knowing that what they are seeing is wrong. And if I could tell you, and of course I won't because it will take so long, I've got hundreds of examples from the 14 countries in which we're working with Think Equal in some stages, rolling out, of children who go home and teach their parents. and successfully so. So the thing that I was terrified of was that we would have cases of parents coming to the teachers and saying, what the hell are you teaching my child? I don't want my child to learn to love the Tamils or the Sinhalese, or, you know, they killed my child's whatever it is, you know, it's not happening. And actually parents are coming and saying, we want more of this, because they do. All parents want their children to thrive and, you know, to grow in good and fertile and supportive soil and not commit the same mistakes as their parents have. It works.
Oh, great. Probably you've already alluded to this, but if you can delve deeper. Changu Manatoko from Bo is asking, how do you factor in patriarchal culture, neocolonialism, and South-North power dynamics that have a role in promoting leading child rights education?
So what we teach is that each and every one of us is of equal value. Now, when we're dealing with children between 3 and 6, we don't teach the misdemeanors and crimes of the past. We are basically building a present, a community of care and love and compassion for our children in their classrooms, hopefully in the homes, although that is a much, much tougher task. But we don't dwell on how things have been bad. These are 3 to 6-year-old children. We are dwelling on how they should be and how human beings are at their best in all their diversity and you know, so in a sense, we are building by example. We are building by instruction and immersing the children experientially in what is good and what is right. Now, as far as breaking patterns is concerned, when children learn that I, as a girl at the age of 3 to 6, can be anything I want to be. I can be an astronaut, and I know this because I'm shown, and I'm playing games with occupation cards that are showing me a girl astronaut and a boy astronaut, and a girl scientist and a boy scientist, and there is no question, there's no questioning that there are patriarchal restrictions on me because of my gender. Well, that is how we're going to break patriarchal values and a system of patriarchy that results in a soldier coming out of a maternity hospital with a little baby, newborn baby in his hands and a gun in the other. That's how we're going to break that. But it's the only way I know of to break it. And that is why that's what I've given the rest of my life to.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Much appreciated. There's one adding question. I'll push this question to both Saudamini and Leslie. So the question is from Shamim Juma in Mombasa County in Kenya, who says, we are struggling with children in conflict with the law. They have no sense of remorse to attack and harm anyone. Now that the damage is already done, what should we do? So, Saudamini, if you don't mind, you can pick part of the question and you can also make a comment in a minute, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you. That's a very tough question, and there is no one answer. I think that, you know, what we're talking about here is how do we make that transition from conflict, war, from the repetition of our human history to actually teach peace, as was mentioned. And does justice contribute to reconciliation? Is justice necessary for peace? And what does justice mean in a particular community? And when children are involved, when they've been recruited and when they've been influenced to take part in hostilities, then how can we recover the humanity in the community in which they live? And indeed, accountability is a part of that. And most significantly, reconciliation and the recognition of our common humanity. How do we teach that? How do we approach that? There are many efforts underway. Again, we can't give up. Too much is at stake. We're living in a very divided world right now, and we need to find ways to come together. So to bring children out of those very extreme situations of violence, there is the necessary process of relearning of both the psychosocial support, but also the education to relearn the values of the community, to recognize the common humanity. I mean, in that specific situation, it's not the only one. It's happening in so many situations, in so many countries, in particular where extreme violence has been used and children have been actually exploited because they're vulnerable, because they don't have necessarily the situation where they can resist, and either forced or forcibly recruited. So that requires a community-based approach. It's a very long process for recovery. Thank you.
Leslie, any insights?
I think Saudamini has said most of what I believe also, and very eloquently. So I'll just keep it very short. I think one of the first things we should do is look at them as human beings and understand what has happened to them. What have they been through? What adverse childhood experiences are they victims of? What sociocultural robotic programming have they been victims of? Because a child, by definition, is someone in need of care and protection. And if that child has perpetrated a crime, the first thing we have to do is be understanding and look at that child from a human lens. And I'd be amazed if there are cases in which we cannot come to understand and forgive that child. And we should see, as I say, we should see our responsibility in teaching that child that the person or persons against whom he or she committed these crimes were lesser to them in some way, or subject to different rules, or whatever enabled them to other this person, because if they saw that person as of equal value to them, they would not have committed that crime, quite simply. So I think, back to what my mantra is just prevent, prevent, prevent. It's so easy. It's so ridiculously cheap. I'm dealing right now with a rollout in South Africa, working with the South African government and the early childhood department. And we've just budgeted, because we are rolling out to every 5-year-old child in South Africa. They start school later there, so we can only begin at 5. It's $2.5 million to give this program 3 times a week for 30 weeks for an entire year to every single 5-year-old in that country. How dare we not do this? How dare we stand in the way as governments or, quasi-governmental bodies, which happens all the time in this struggle to give the children what is their fundamental right, the right to a foundation for positive outcomes in life.
Thank you so much.
Just add one more
Yes,
point to that to increase the complexity, because when we were working with the Truth Commission in Liberia, well, the position was that children should not be subjected to judicial accountability. They should not be prosecuted for the crimes of the war. But some of the commanders spoke out and they said, look, we were recruited as children too. And we were also vulnerable. We just happened to have lived a little bit longer while the war continued. What about us? We also want to be forgiven. And we also want to be brought back into the community. I'm generalizing here to make the point, but the point is that we are all human beings, as Leslie was saying, and we have to really remember that in order to pursue non-recurrence, in order for prevention and recovery as well.
Wow.
Declan, could I just a quick comment on this?
Yes.
I think in the end, it really depends on what program every country has for reintegration of child offenders in society. You could go through the restorative process, but how do you reintegrate them into the family, into society? And that calls for effective programs that I believe can be suitably defined, designed to bring the kind of corrective ends that we all look to. Thank you.